the discussion, we will have, after the presentation, we'll have a discussion, and those who are joining us on Zoom, please type your questions into the chat box. And now I'd like to invite our ambassador of the Republic of Lithuania to the United States of America and the United Mexican States, Audra Plepytė.
It's great to have you here in the embassy. Another event, another discussion, but this discussion, I would say, very, very special. The occasion is very special. The time is very special as well. This week, the United States celebrates, or not celebrates, or commemorates Day of Remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust. One of the darkest pages of human history, the recent history, which is commemorated all over the globe. I mean, almost 30 countries and United Nations have its own week or day of commemorating this one of the worst atrocities and crimes against humanity. This week, it started on Monday, is for the United States. So we also wanted to join that week with also a voice from the Embassy of Lithuania. Because anti-Semitism, Holocaust, when one nation, from the children, babies, to the elders, women, men, were declared to be swept out of from the earth just because of their nationality or because of their religion. So we have to remember that. We have to know that. We thought that that could remain for the history. Just we have to remember not to be repeated. Unfortunately, what we see recently, that rise of hatred, rise of anti-Semitism, religion, and hatred in general against those people who maybe think a bit differently, look differently. So all these things which we've been already talking for the decades is still very important and valid today. So that's why we are raising also our voice for that, for the discussion. And we're really blessed and happy that Professor Suziedėlis is joining us today for this event. Is one of the most renowned, well-known person in Lithuania. So he from the United States as well, so from both sides of Atlantic as well, has been working and dedicated his life and work for these discussions and on these ideas. Not only history of Russia, Eastern Europe, Lithuania, but also the Holocaust and genocide. So that's why I'm not going to talk a lot or almost none, because I would like to give much more time for Professor Suziedėlis his thoughts and his well-researched ideas, what is this, what is Holocaust and that. But I also would like to share and to draw your attention, especially those who are here, not on the internet, to the surroundings. We have here exposition about the righteous, about the people who were not afraid to not only, maybe they didn't raise their voice, I wanted to say their voice, but by action to save the people. They knew that they are risking their own lives, their own families, but they were anyways on the right side of the history. And their example also teaches us today that we have to make choices every day. And there are people who are not afraid even such worst situations in life when they have to choose between evil and good, between life and death. So I think that also that's why we wanted to have this exposure, not only showing that there were people also who were there, but also that would be example for us that we need not to give up and to have a courage to face and to contradict all these bad things. So now I'm very also grateful that today we have Special Envoy for Holocaust, Ellen Germain from the State Department, who would be we invite to have a couple of words as well before we turn to Professor Suziedėlis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Plepytė, and thank you for inviting me here and for helping us to commemorate the U.S. National Days of Holocaust Remembrance. So, why did people risk their lives, and as the ambassador said, often their families' lives, to help people who were sometimes complete strangers? Certainly there are no easy answers to that question. And of course, I think we all wonder, what would I do if faced by that choice? Would I risk my life? Would I speak out? For myself, I hope so, but none of us can know until we're actually faced with that decision. Some people did take that risk. Israel's Holocaust Memorial and Museum, Yad Vashem, calls them the righteous among nations. And it pays tribute to them by adding their names to the Wall of Honor in the Garden of the Righteous. The people highlighted in this exhibition around the walls that we will be looking at tonight are some of the 924 Lithuanians who have been honored by Yad Vashem as having saved Jews. They may have hidden Jews in their homes, provided false papers or false identities, or smuggled or helped Jews escape danger. Yesterday, I hosted an event at the State Department as part of our commemoration of the National Days of Remembrance. And at that event, we were honored by the presence of 2 Holocaust survivors who told their stories. For both of them, their lives were saved by people, strangers, who took risks. The doctors and nurses who hid a young girl in a concentration camp when she was very ill. The stranger who risked his life to go into the Warsaw Ghetto and to bring out a 7-year-old boy under the very noses of Nazi soldiers. So there were people from all walks of life who did the right thing when it was needed most. Their stories remind us that goodness can shine in the midst of evil. But I also know that these are indeed no simple stories. And we're going to hear about that tonight from the professor. But we do have to keep listening to and telling these stories in all their complexity so that we don't forget and so that we're teaching the younger generations about what happened. And we must teach the truth, the facts. And one fact is that the Holocaust was not inevitable. Studying the Holocaust is important because it shows us that such atrocities are a process that can perhaps be challenged or even stopped in the future. Supporting and promoting accurate Holocaust education and commemoration is something that the United States is fully committed to and which is a focus of my work. And it's important both for the lessons that we can learn from the Holocaust and as the study of an unprecedented attempt to murder all European Jews and extinguish their culture, an attempt that fundamentally challenged human values. As President Biden said on Monday at the U.S. National Days of Holocaust Remembrance at the Capitol, we know hate never goes away, it only hides. And given a little oxygen, it comes out from under rocks. But we also know what stops hate. One thing, all of us. He added that we have an obligation to learn the lessons of history so we don't surrender our future to the horrors of the past. We must give hate no safe harbor against anyone. As we all know, there has been a frightening rise in anti-Semitism in the United States and worldwide, especially since October 7th. It's up to all of us to speak out against that, to take whatever action we can, and to not sit idly by when we hear or see anti-Semitism. The stories of the righteous among the nations show that a single person has the power to put aside differences, understand our common humanity, and stand up to hate. Such individuals took risks because they understood that what was being done to Jews was wrong. Most of us will never be faced with that type of decision. But I'm sure that tonight's talk by Professor Suziedėlis and this exhibition here at the Lithuanian Embassy, both of which are about these complicated stories of those who helped Jews during the Holocaust, both of them will inform our thinking as we struggle every day to do the right thing in this complicated world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellen. Now I would like to turn back again to Professor Saulius Suziedėlis, our prominent scientist, historian, Professor Emeritus of University at Millersville University. Professor Suziedėlis graduated from the Catholic University of Americas in Washington, D.C. back in 1967. Then he worked where he studied European history. Then he worked as a teacher in Ethiopia, for those who don't know. And later on, he studied Polish language and literature in Poznan, Poland. Was intern in the History of the University of Warsaw. Received PhD in history at the University of Kansas. His studies was history of Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Middle Ages and Slavic studies. Suziedėlis worked also with the Department of Justice of the United States, also with radio station Voice of America, where he was prepared historical political programs. Professor is well known for his research, as I mentioned, in history, but also in Holocaust and genocide. And for those who know, today is also a very special day because we are going to present the professor with the order, this award, the President of the Republic of Lithuania, Officer Cross, Order for Merits to Lithuania. So for his special attention and research of the history of Holocaust in Eastern Europe and Lithuania. So I would like to invite my colleague now to some formal procedures to read the order. For those who don't understand, we are very sorry, but that would be in Lithuanian. So Lithuanians, though, that's one advantage to know Lithuanian, but that is, since Professor Suziedėlis is fluent in Lithuanian, so we have that in Lithuania, and then we present, yes.
Thank you. So, as Ambassador mentioned, this is the order, and I will read the decree of the President of the Republic of Lithuania. Lietuvos Respublikos Prezidentas dekretas dėl apdovanojimo Lietuvos valstybės ordinais ir medaliais. 2023 metų vasario 14 diena, numeris 1K1237, Vilnius. Vadovaudamasis Lietuvos Respublikos Konstitucijos 84 straipsnio 22 punktų, Lietuvos Respublikos valstybės apdovanojimo įstatymo 4 straipsnio 1 dalimi, 1 straipsnis. Apdovanoju vasario 16-osios Lietuvos valstybės atkūrimo dienos proga už nuopelnus Lietuvos Respublikai ir už Lietuvos vardo garsinimą pasaulyje. Šio dekreto 2 straipsnėje nurodytus Lietuvos Respublikos ir užsienio valstybių piliečius. 2 straipsnis. Apdovanoju ordino už nuopelnus Lietuvai karininko kryžiumi Saulių Augustiną Suziedėlį. Millersville Universiteto istorijos profesorių emeritą, mokslininką už ypatingą dėmesį skiriamą Holokausto Rytų Europoje ir Lietuvoje istorijos tyrinėjimams. Lietuvos Respublikos prezidentas Gitanas Nausėda.
Professor. Sveikinu labai.
Ačiū. Ekscelencija, nuoširdus ačiū už suteiktą apdovanojimą. Taip pat prašyčiau perduoti prezidentui Nausėdai taip pat mano padėka už tokį įvertinimą. Šį vakarą taip pat man mintyje stovi visi bendraminčiai, kolegos ir bičiuliai, nes tik tai jų pagalbos dėka sugebėjau dirbti, pravesti tyrimus, rašyti istoriją. I would like to thank Her Excellency, the Ambassador, for this honor, as well as President Nausėda for awarding this recognition. But I also need to keep in mind my colleagues, friends, fellow travelers in the field of history from many countries without whose help my research and work in this field would be impossible. The talk I'm going to give today is one which may sound somewhat discordant to people here we are here for a commemoration, for memory. The work of the historian, as I think I will point out here, is somewhat different. Let me begin with a personal note, if you will allow me. Most of my friends in my youth and college years shared the same experience. We arrived in the U.S. and Canada, in U.S. and Canada, as young children from the DP camps, and grew up in largely Lithuanian ethnic communities of long standing. In my case, in Brockton, Massachusetts. I recall from my youth that very few people in our community spoke of the Jews. My level of knowledge as a youngster was limited to reading Leon Uris's Exodus at age 16, where I was shocked to find Lithuanians described as perpetrators during the Holocaust. I had no idea at the time that I was, in a way, only steps away from that history and clueless about it, so let me explain. One of my childhood chums was one Andrew Ava. What enhanced our friendship was that our mothers were very close friends. We later lost touch. He went on to West Point. I chose college elsewhere. But our paths crossed decades later, at which point Andy told me something about his family of which I had been utterly ignorant. His grandmother had sheltered a young Jewish girl in 1944 in an apartment in Vilnius. She is right here behind me. Andy's mother, then a young woman, and the Jewish girl lived together in secret as sisters, both named Irena. One, a Lithuanian blonde, the other dark-haired. The grandmother was Stefania Ladigienė, and since 1992 she is number 5215 on Yad Vashem's list of righteous among the nations. The Jewish girl in question was Irena Veisaitė. I think I should make this work. If you could help the next slide. Thank you. A scholar, teacher, Holocaust survivor, whom I was privileged to know for almost 30 years. Her experience, wisdom, and moral compass motivated me to continue working on trying to understand a difficult history. I have dedicated my forthcoming book, scheduled to appear later this year, to the memory of this absolutely remarkable woman. You may wonder about the title of my presentation. I borrowed it from a conference at the Institute of Jewish Studies at University College London in 2011, which was entitled, quote, "No Simple Stories, Jewish-Lithuanian Relations Between Coexistence and Violence." The conference was open to the public, and there were protests from the floor. Some attendees seemed unhappy at the idea that the history of Jewish-Lithuanian relations should be seen other than through the prism of violent anti-Semitism, as the title of the conference indicated. This, it seems, was a threat to that popular and straightforward narrative. You know, Princeton historian Neville Irvin Painter recently lamented in The New Yorker on what she described as, quote, "the national hunger for simplifying history." This hunger is compounded by another related problem. Historian Peter Hayes put it a slightly different way. In his very thoughtful book, Why? Explaining the Holocaust, Hayes commented, quote, "about how wide a gap has grown between what specialists know and what much of the public believes about the Holocaust." or in Paul Levine's words, the divide between scholarship and public memory, constituting a veritable clash between town and gown. Part of the problem is that historians' knowledge of the past is constantly evolving, even as they accept that which is already known. In some sense, every historian worth his or her salt is a quote-unquote revisionist. Otherwise, historical research would lose its reason for being. This is not always easy to convey to people outside the academy. In this brief presentation, I would like to describe the historical context in which rescue took place and the place of those who chose saving lives over other behavioral alternatives. First, who were the European rescuers of the Jews? The Yad Vashem list of righteous among nations currently names nearly 28,000 persons. The real number is probably considerably larger, rescuers who were not on the list. In January of 22, the Republic of Lithuania consisted of 924 righteous Gentiles. In proportion to population, that is, acknowledged rescuers per 100,000 persons in the population, only the Netherlands has more citizens on the Yad Vashem list. The Gaon State Museum in Vilnius estimates the number of Lithuanian families who rescue Jews at roughly about 2,300. The rescuers, when we see them as individuals, not in the broad context of history, when we acknowledge them, were included from all social categories, from political elites to uneducated rural folk. Kazys Grinius, I'm sorry, this is Stefania Ladigienė, my apologies, and her husband, General Kazys Ladiga, who at one point was the commander of the Lithuanian army. These are two pictures of them. He was executed by the Soviets in 1941. She was deported to the Gulag in also late 1940s. One of the things about Lithuanian rescuers is they didn't get much of a reward when the Soviets came back in summer of 1944. One of them, Bishop Vincas Borisevičius, who helped save Esther Yellen, the famous Israeli piano concert as a young child. He took her to the nuns in a convent, saved her life, was executed by the Soviets in 1946. I mentioned already Stefania Ladigienė. Jadvyga Jablonskienė, another rescuer, related somewhat to Stefania, was also arrested after the war, as was the father, priest Bronius Paukštys, as well as others. This is a story not so simple and reflects the reality in Lithuania that did not exist for rescuers who lived in Western Europe. Toliau. This is Juozas and Onas Trimaitis. He was an army officer, that is, in the high political elite, military officer, who also helped rescue Irena Veisaitė by providing them papers so she could leave the Kaunas ghetto and then find shelter in the city among friendly Gentiles. Next. This is Kazys Grinius, whom you can see on the right side over there, and his family. He was a former president of the country in 1926. Furthermore, and this is Ona Landsbergienė. She is the mother of the first head of state after independence in 1990, Vytautas Landsbergis. She is his mother, but more interesting is the fact that she was the wife of a minister in the Lithuanian Provisional Government of 1941, which was a pro-German government, and had adopted a campaign against Bolshevism. Next. This is Jadvyga Jablonskienė, whom I mentioned earlier, and her story is in somewhat the same vein. She was the sister of a high official of the Vilnius Citizens Committee, which was a collaborating institution under Nazi rule in the city of Vilnius, of course. Next. This is Bronius Paukštys. The reason that clergy in Lithuania are disproportionately represented among really effective rescuers was that until 1940 there was no civil registry in the country. Births and marriages were registered by the clerics of the different religious communities, rabbis, mullahs, Catholic priests, Protestant pastors. For a child to survive, he had to have papers, baptismal records, something of that sort, and that, of course, often came through church. The next, please. This is Ona Šimaitė. She is well known among Lithuanians as a rescuer. She was a simple librarian in the Vilnius University Library, and she began her career as a rescuer by helping Jews in the Vilnius ghetto. She had a special permit which allowed her to visit the ghetto and carry messages back and forth, as well as rescue at least 2 women that we know of. Now, as I said, high and low. This is Bronius Gotautas. He was a brother in the Catholic clerical establishment, a very lowly, somewhat uneducated. His contemporaries say he may have been almost illiterate. Quite a contrast to Father Bronius Paukštys, who was well educated, a traveler, and had even written scholarly articles. What Bronius Gotautas did, which was very helpful, he forged papers. He took baptismal records and church records, blanks, from the parishes, and then distributed to people, professional forgers, who could then create documents for particularly Jewish children and young adults, who could then pass checkpoints, police checkpoints, and all kinds of searches of that kind. Next, please. And this is, if we're talking about high social elites, the peasant woman, Bronislava Dainauskienė. She sheltered a rather famous Jewish person, famous in Lithuanian literature. Next, please. Itzokas Meras. The story here is an interesting one. It occurred in Kelmė, in western Lithuania, when the Jewish citizens of the town were being shot that day, and some of the killers, executioners, decided to leave children behind. Either they no longer had the heart to kill, or they simply forgot. These children were left unattended. Some of the local women came and snatched up these children and took them in. In this case, Itzokas Meras, as you may know, is the author of numerous Lithuanian language novels, translated into many languages. He died in Israel in 2014. A wonderful person to talk to. I spoke to him on the phone several times. He was an extremely interesting personality. Next, please. What I've described here are individual stories, and in some sense, they are similar and rather simple in some ways. However, I would like to examine briefly the social and historical context in which these rescuers were embedded, a macro history, if you will, or a view of the past from 30,000 feet. We know well the actual organizers and perpetrators of the Shoah, the Nazi officials of the Reich, SS commanders, the collaborating militarized police units of the occupied countries. In Lithuania, they played a very prominent role. I have described that in detail in other works, but I will not do so tonight. That is, these are people that had operational agency of the genocide. They could begin or they could stop it at any moment. I want to stress that fact. The role of the Third Reich was crucial. No Hitler, no Holocaust. No German occupiers, no genocide. And then we have to talk about, however, what of the ordinary people who either watched all this? I would argue that these ordinary people did not have operational agency to stop the slaughter in most cases, but they did have moral agency in their choice of how to respond. It is difficult to gauge what was in the minds of the people at the time. Understandably, most ghetto inmates, and especially the hunted Jews in hiding, believed that most of the world was against them. People who pitied Jews may have assigned their own feelings to fellow bystanders. There were no Gallup polls about this back then. Neighbors who helped Jewish victims, despite a hostile environment, may have believed that they were but a lonely few, although rescuers who passed on their charges to others might have concluded that the network of righteous was larger than in reality. Most rescuers were not active members of any anti-Nazi resistance movement and were but a small slice of the entire population. The historian is left with the task to mine the available, albeit admittedly challenging sources for insights into what people thought at the time. Now, diaries, memoirs, anecdotal evidence, they're by their nature, they're snapshots. The opinions in these sources are shaped by authors' perspectives. Educated observers often wrote down what they saw, but the voices of ordinary people are often accessible only in recorded oral testimonies years after the fact. We speak of perpetrators, bystanders, rescuers, the concerned and the indifferent, the empathetic, and those gleeful at Jewish misfortune. It's a very human spectrum of responses to mass murder, and you see all of it in both academic archival sources and in diaries and memories. On August 1st, 1941, after 6 weeks of the Nazi occupation, despite the pogroms, initial killings in the border zone of Lithuania by German-led units, the selective killings in the provinces, nearly 90% of the estimated 200,000 of Lithuania's Jews, the Litvaks, were still alive. By the end of October, 3/4 were dead. At its core, the destruction of Lithuania's Jews involved a campaign of sustained mass shootings between early August and late October 1941, as you can see in this chart. This effectively annihilated the country's historic shtetls and has been described by some historians as, quote unquote, the Holocaust by bullets. What did rescuers see and hear about this? I'm talking about ordinary people. Unlike the murders carried out in the industrial chambers of Nazi-occupied Poland, the Holocaust in Lithuania attracted the attention of observers in real time. News of the massacres spread quickly in a small country. Many bystanders had seen the police marching columns of Jews to the killing sites, including my own father. There were eyewitnesses at the pits, the killing fields, especially in the provinces, so first and second-hand accounts related these unforgettable sights and sounds of the shootings of a wider public. Since they lacked operational agency, most ordinary people in Nazi-occupied Europe were not deciders in determining the ultimate fate of European Jewry. While there were egregious acts of communal violence, pogroms in Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine in particular, these events constitute statistical outliers in the death count. Spectacular case of Yad Vashem in Poland, where neighbors did kill neighbors, hundreds of them, or the famous Litukis garage photos, if you've seen them, of the murder of Jews in Kaunas in June 27th, 1941, by people in the town. If these events had constituted the norm, today historians would be researching this period not as a Holocaust, but as one of the post-medieval waves of anti-Jewish violence which the majority of people survived and often returned to their previous lives, but not a Holocaust. For example, two come to mind of the most egregious. Bogdan Khmelnytsky's Cossack raids in the mid-17th century, which killed many thousands of Jews, Catholics, and of course the early post-World War I period, the so-called Russian Civil War, during which tens of thousands, at least, of Jews were murdered by the various sides in the conflict. The Holocaust was not like this. And in those killings, yes, there were many instances of neighbors killing neighbors. The Holocaust was unique in its thoroughness and its intent, as we all know. Most of the approximately 6 million Jewish victims, it will never be an exact number, but we know the scale, did not die at the hands of their neighbors in any literal sense. The vast majority, I think it's safe to say, 95% at a minimum, the vast majority, were annihilated in 3 ways. 1, mass shooting operations that I have already mentioned, of the kind depicted in this chart, carried out by militarized army and police units, mainly in the Baltic states, West Ukraine, parts of Poland, and elsewhere. By the way, Germany, the German forces, police forces, and their collaborators were not the only ones engaged in this kind of very active policy. The Romanian army and police carried out on their own, without German direction, massive killings in eastern Romania and beyond, as far as Odessa, during the invasion of the summer and fall of 1941. The second wave and method of killing, of course, is the well-known method of industrialized factories of death in occupied Poland, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, Chełmno, Belzec. I think a plurality of Jewish victims died in this way. We think somewhere in the vicinity of well over 2.5 million. The number of people killed in mass shootings was probably in the vicinity of roughly 1.7 million. But there was a third, even more cruel in some ways, method, policy of annihilation, purposeful starvation in the ghettos, and the creation of conditions of life in the large urban ghettos of Eastern Europe. Warsaw and Vilnius come to mind, and the periodic killings of the old and infirm who were no longer needed for work. And this was the third method. All of these methodologies of murder required a massive bureaucratic and police apparatus. They could not have been done by ordinary people, no matter how much they wanted to do this. Most Jews were murdered by people they did not know. For their part, ordinary Lithuanians and even society's elites lacked the power, the operational agency to halt the genocide. However, there is a very important however here. For those thousands of Jews who escaped these three methods of annihilation and managed to blend into the countryside or hide among sympathetic people in the cities, or, and this is not always understood correctly, living in family encampments in the forests, these people, their fate, did not depend on the Third Reich Germans, did not depend on collaborating police institutions, depended entirely on choices made by their Gentile neighbors. This is where the moral operational capability of individual people making choices becomes operational ability. They can make a difference. They can save a life, or they can cause a life to die by informing. You can imagine the temptation to notice that someone is living next door not quite right. A person perhaps of a darker hue, a child who doesn't speak fluent Lithuanian. The temptation could be to turn that person in and get the award. The choices ordinary people, in this case, in this particular part of the Holocaust, meant life or death for their Jewish fellow citizens. Now, aside from the killers, some people made different choices. They chose to loot the property of neighbors who had vanished. You can imagine, and I've told this by many people, by the way, that usually, at least in Varėna and a few other towns where I was privileged to talk to people who know this, very old people, of course, they said, look, after the people were killed, for about 2 or 3 days, there was a sense of loss and complete disorientation. A kind of quiet enveloped the town. And then, at some point, the looting started. It was triggered by 1 or 2 people, and it became kind of a massive thing. These are the belongings of people being auctioned in Utena, near the Rashe forest where the Jews had been killed. That was one choice. These people didn't have to do that, just as the people did not have to save lives. They couldn't prevent the genocide as such, but they could have chosen certain behaviors. Now, what I also want to point out that is, there is one story that is interesting from the point of view, as I was saying, that although most Jews were not killed by their immediate neighbors, there were some instances where this was true, and they were not that few. All I was arguing was that in the vast majority of cases, this was not what happened. This is Matilda Olkinaitė. This is her high school graduation photo. She was a remarkable woman from a very interesting family. Her father was a pharmacist in a small town in Panemunėlis in northern Lithuania, not far from Rokiškis. That's why she went to school in high school there. She wrote almost entirely in Lithuanian as a young poet, something unusual at the time. She had, many people thought, a literary career ahead of her. And when she graduated from Rokiškis, she went on to study in Kaunas French literature and then the University of Vilnius. Her family were killed by locals who thought that a pharmacist must have a lot of money, and they murdered them. And here we have also, in this spectrum of reactions, let's remember that there were people who were not rescuers, but who did reach out a helping hand. In the story of Matilda, when she was arrested, the local parish priest, who was a friend of the family, said, well, why don't you come to this old building I know about and hide there? They decided in the end not to do that. They were afraid for the benefactor. The father was a good friend of theirs. So they allowed themselves to be in this room under arrest for actually weeks, several weeks. Local friends of Matilda and their mothers would come and bring food to the family. They knew they were having a problem, and whenever they found a friendly guard that, who was guarding them, they would bring food and supplies as best they could. This is not uncommon. As you can imagine, the spectrum of responses, once again, is quite wide. Some people reached out a helping hand and didn't do much later. Some people rescued. And of course, some people killed, some people turned in, some people informed the authorities. Now, I want to, the next, please. So that was an individual story. That is a picture of Matilda in her high school class. She is sitting there, the first on the left. Next. I want to talk about what realities did they face on a European scale. There are some interesting points to consider. The enormous area of German-occupied Europe was enormously varied in terms of its regions. This map is deceptive, actually. It hides enormous differences in the experience of ordinary people. So, if we go to Denmark, people like to point out Denmark as an example of successful rescue. And then Poland, of course, if you go southeast of that. But let's talk about Denmark. In no way to demean the rescue effort in October 1943, which saved 7,000 more Jews, more than 90% of Denmark's population. But for all practical purposes, ordinary people in central Poland and ordinary people in Denmark during the 5 years of German occupation might as well have lived on different planets in terms of their day-to-day experience. Less than 1% of Danes died under German occupation, out of a population of 3,750,000. I don't have to remind people here, who I'm sure are well read, of the realities in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the real black holes of the world during the Second World War. No regions other than those experienced such devastation, such cruelty. Undeniably, this must have had, of course, a great impact on whether rescue attempts were successful and how widespread they were. And by the way, one of the factors in the Danish case that we now know is that the German forces did not make any real serious effort to stop the flotilla once it started, once it began. Although they did try, they did have a policy of deportation that was waiting in the wings, but it was never allowed to come to term. Sweden was close by, and the Swedes, after some hesitation, did assist in this operation. Now, in terms of Nazi violence against non-Jewish civilians, which is an important factor in rescue, because it sort of impacts how you're going to react in terms of taking risks. And let us remember that some rescuers didn't take hardly any risks. I have in mind the diplomats and the consuls, Sugihara, Jan Svartindik in Kaunas, Mendes, the Portuguese consul in Marseille, France. Their personal risk, they had risks to their careers, yes. Their personal risks were minimal. Now, let's also remember, but the personal risks, of course, for someone in the dark areas I described, the black hole of humanity during the Second World War, I think it's a race in terms of this horrible Olympics of suffering, whether Belarus and Ukraine were worse, or the Poland. I mean, these were places where not only Jews were killed, but hundreds of thousands, if not several million, of course, non-Jewish citizens were massacred in various ways. And these regions experienced, by the way, communal violence on a gigantic scale, particularly in eastern Poland between Poles and Ukrainians in the latter part of the war, where there were tens of thousands were massacred. Not by Germans, but by nationalist forces on each side, Polish and Ukrainian, against one another. Lithuania was somewhere in the middle. It certainly was nowhere near the kind of oppressive devastation that Poland experienced, or Belarus. But, for example, I can prove this by simply pointing out that there is a village in Lithuania called Pirčiupė. If you drive from Vilnius to the southeast, you'll follow this big statue, the mother of Pirčiupė. It commemorates a village where about, I think it's 120, but I have to check my figures, of Lithuanian, non-Jewish Lithuanians were burned to death in barns by the Germans as retaliation against a partisan attack. That's one instance. Across the border in Belarus, there are literally thousands of such villages. So Lithuania did experience anti-Nazi violence against the non-Jewish population. And it was not a rosy situation such as in Denmark, and I'm being a little sarcastic here, I do understand. Denmark was under foreign occupation, but as I pointed out, in a different sense than other parts of Europe. For example, can I have the next one, please? This is Vytautas Juodka. In Poland, we know that hundreds of Polish rescuers lost their lives when they were shot by German and collaborating police forces for sheltering Jews. There were instances often where when they were uncovered, they would drag the people out who were sheltering and the people who were sheltered, that is the Jews, and shoot them on the spot. As a rule, this was not the practice in Lithuania. But however, this man, Vytautas Juodka, who was a musician, he played the zither and he was an actor, he was executed in January 1942 for sheltering 2 Jewish women. We know that in the Kaunas ghetto situation, a sentry shot a person trying to bring food to Jews. It happened. I would think that maybe about a dozen Lithuanian Gentiles lost their lives during the German occupation in this way. Now, the other thing, so what I'm arguing here, trying to point out in the no simple story thing, is that the situation, the German policy as such, the occupation policy, was very different in different parts of Europe. Spectacularly different, as I pointed out in the case of the contrast of Denmark and Poland. But there's also this issue of regional anti-Semitism. And this is an issue that can raise some emotions. How important was popular anti-Semitism as a deciding factor in the death rate of Jews across Europe? And here we come into correlations and statistics that don't seem to match and seem somewhat counterintuitive. And I return now to a very insightful essay written by historian Timothy Snyder in an article called Commemorative Causality, in which he says and argues, and I think successfully, that anti-Semitism was a necessary but insufficient causal factor for the Holocaust. I'll read his words. He writes, quote, "Without Hitler's anti-Semitism, his understanding and presentation of the Jews as a global threat to Germany." Let me pause here just for a second. I just had a light bulb in my head. In teaching about this to students, I often hear, in the lower grades particularly, teachers say something like this: the Jews were killed simply because they were Jews. That's a statement that is a fact, and it's compelling. I never use that with college students, however. Why? Because it doesn't explain very much. The Germans, essentially Hitler particularly, did not kill the Jews simply because they were Jews. They killed them, and this is as bizarre as this seems today. They killed Jews as a group because they felt they were a collective threat to the German future. They actually believed this. You can see it in their writings. Which means that collective guilt is the sine qua non, is the real reason for all genocides. It doesn't work without it. Whether we're talking about Rwanda or Cambodia, mass murder, or the Holocaust, without collective guilt, the policy and the politics of genocide simply don't work. You're guilty as a group. Now, he says, well, like, without this anti-Semitism, this collective guilt, the Holocaust would not have happened. To say so is to specify a necessary condition for the German attempt to exterminate the Jews of Europe. But a plausible historical explanation of any significant historical event must be plural. It must include causality, that together are not only necessary but sufficient. For the purpose of explaining the Holocaust, then anti-Semitism is not enough. For the purpose of its commemoration, it is. And ours is an age of memory rather than history, and the two are not the same. Commemoration requires no adequate explanation as to the catastrophe. As cultures of memory supplant concern for history, the danger is that historians will find themselves drawn to explanations that are the simplest to convey. End of quote. And this is why I chose this theme today of no simple story. Historians can be annoying in this. As journalists of the past, I see as, the phrase, to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Our job sometimes is to afflict the smug. Now, contrary to popular narrative, I think, it's difficult to find a correlation between historical levels of anti-Semitism in the different regions of Axis-controlled Europe and Holocaust death rates. In liberally democratic Netherlands, with a stellar reputation for tolerance, 75% of Jews were killed. In France, which was the kernel of anti-Semitism in the 19th century, and one of the great originators of anti-Semitism Europe-wide, the death rate was 25%. And many of these were foreign Jews, not French Jews. Romania, which during the interwar period, and this is also crucial to understand, had a massive fascist anti-Semitic violent movement which killed thousands of Jews, and whose army carried out massive massacres, as I've mentioned, in the summer and fall during the invasion of the Soviet Union. The death rate was 50%. Poland, Lithuania, 90%. Now, Lithuania had a problem with anti-Semitism in the interwar period, but there is no record in the latest research I've done between 1920, when the newly independent government was in control of the country, and 1940, when a Jew was killed in any kind of a lynching or mob violence. There were outbreaks of communal violence, but they pale in comparison to what happened in Romania during the interwar period. So why is the death rate in Lithuania 90% and the death rate in Romania 50%? Hungary and Finland are other examples where we can look at the figures, and they don't seem to correlate with this popular notion that anti-Semitism in the general populace was the driving cause of the death rate of the Jews, in comparison, rather, to other things. Now, what I've been arguing, coming to my conclusion here a little bit, is that what I'm trying to say is the rescuers faced very challenging conditions which were radically different in different parts of Europe. This is a fact. And it must have, this is difficult research to do in terms of causal relationships. how do you prove that people whose behavior often is multi-causal behave in a certain way because of one thing? But then let's also look at the rescuers as people, as a group socially. Who were they? Well, as I indicated earlier, they represented all social classes, the high and the low. Diplomats, consular officials, I mentioned already Sugihara, Svartendik. Raoul Wallenberg was one of the few consular people who actually met an untimely death among these people. Rescuers often represented a very wide variety of political ideologies. Some were communists, others were anti-communists. Some were nationalists, some were cosmopolitan liberals. And some had checkered histories, and you sometimes wonder. Next, please. Oskar Schindler, immortalized by Steven Spielberg, has, unfortunately in my view, become a stellar representative in the popular mind of heroic people rescuing Jews. Not to say that he was not a hero, but after all, he was a member of the Nazi Party. He was a German spy and a manufacturer of weapons for the Wehrmacht. The same Wehrmacht which was fighting a war which was resulting in the extermination of many people. He is one of Yad Vashem's righteous Gentiles. Now, it's true, reading his biography, that he did change his opinion quite a bit as time went on. True. But we have this history. And next. And this is a really annoying one that's counterintuitive. Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky of Lviv. He was the Metropolitan of the so-called Greek Catholic Church, or the Uniates as they're called sometimes, Eastern Rite Catholics. He publicly, one of the few churchmen, condemned the killing of Jews and instructed his flock not to do so, particularly regarding children. He helped save hundreds of Jewish children. His older brother, Clementi Sheptytsky, was a monk and is on the Yad Vashem's Righteous Gentiles list. By the way, Clementi Sheptytsky died in the Gulag after the war, so he was also arrested by the Nazis. Some of these people, by the way, were arrested by both. This was not something that, it seems counterintuitive to Americans. And finally, a real discordant note, and then I'll finish with a hopeful one. You know, the Polish scholar Nechama Tetz wrote a work in which she described the pious Catholic Polish women who saved children and revealed their anti-Semitic prejudices. These women who risked their lives to save children were, by our standards, anti-Semites in their views. Can it be, in my mind, I'm sure that some Lithuanian village women also, who went and clutched children from the throat of death, may also have been perhaps harboring prejudices that they learned at their mother's knee. Anti-Semitic rescuers. Seems kind of counterintuitive. Well, it shouldn't be surprising, really, should it, to Americans? If you look at American abolitionists as a group and read what they wrote, my hair, I can't stand up, but yours might, to what they wrote. And if you want a simple story, now, Thaddeus Stevens and John Brown were exceptions to this, these racist abolitionists. Anyone who wants a simple story should not read the speeches of Abraham Lincoln during the 1950s and his statements on race, by the way. So this is what I mean by not a simple story. Now, the people that you see in this exhibit, their stories are straightforward. In one sense that is important to us, they made a choice. The choice was simple. Their stories are not. The situations they lived in were not. They were intensely complicated. But their choice was correct and good. And the fact that some of them had inner conflict, to me, makes them even more heroes than others. Because that choice was difficult, but they made it. Most of them were ordinary people who took a righteous path and accepted no excuses to avoid that decision. And their decision leaves us today in our age with no excuses either. If these people could have made that choice, I think we can do the same if we are ever called to make such a decision in our lives. That is, all important moral choices of this type reside within us, not anyone else. I'm sorry that I brought forth some themes that do not, to use the slang term, jive with a sense of commemoration, pride, national honor, and the rest. Historians tend to leave that to the poets and the politicians. Our job as professional historians is different. We have to look at the story from most angles, and we have to make uncomfortable choices as to what to present the public in our research. So anyway, I know I've talked too long, and that I hope that we got something out of this. I certainly am very grateful for the award I got. I am so happy that so many of you showed up today, and I hope that you will come away from this with an understanding that just because history is complicated, sometimes contradictory, often counterintuitive, there is a moral message here when we talk about the rescuers. And I think this exhibit here, you can look at it and look at all these different stories and see that so clearly. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was really thought-provoking, and I believe you have lots of questions. So let Professor rest his legs, but not his mind. And if someone would like to start with questions or comments.
Studies, whether interviews or maybe even just how they're doing of the children of rescuers, like how do they feel about what their parents decided to do? I mean, they may have ended up, being sacrificed or not. I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm wondering if that's been studied.
In my own community, there was a general, not 100%, but a general silence about all these issues. For example, I never knew that my best friend's mom was a daughter of a rescuer. So, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I know that in American politics, Saul and Lucius's parents or his grandparents or parents, are rescuers. They're on the list of the righteous Gentiles, if you look under Anusius, I believe. So he was on TV the other day. So, but not aware that he ever talked about it in public, so I'm not sure. There's a lot that has been written, obviously, about the children and grandchildren of perpetrators, quite a bit. And in the Lithuanian case, books by granddaughters, mainly. I have in mind Julia Šukytė and Sylvia Foti, for example, and Rita Gabis, which is the best of the genre, I think, called that A Shooter's Banquet, which is quite well researched. She stands out. Well, Julia Šukytė is a professional historian and literature teacher. So there is, at least I know, about a dozen, well, close to about half a dozen or more such granddaughters. But I don't know much about I'm sorry to say. No, that's a research question for someone, yes. I believe they should do something with that.
I had a question about the timeline that you showed of the killings of Jews by shooting. That chart was 1941?
Yes.
So I know the information in my own family was that there were, I guess, sort of rumors or some sort of information that my great-grandfather had been killed, but that information was in July 1944, and then it wasn't found out until some time later, so that my brother could not be named after his great-grandfather.
Oh.
So, again, I'm just confirming it was 41?
Yeah,
the information came out so much later?
In your case, it makes sense because with two exceptions, until early August, as a general rule, always exceptions, they did not kill women and children. They did not kill women and children, as a general rule, until early August 1941. Mostly men of so-called military age, considered a threat, people between anywhere from teenagehood to 45 or 50. Now, of course, there were exceptions again, and people whom they suspected of communist activity. That and shootings in the border zone for security reasons were the main number of victims before early August of 41. There are victims of pogroms in Lithuania. Probably, we think, around 2,000 people between the invasion of June 22nd and probably this early August period, but mostly within the first week or so, a week and a half, killed in communal violence of the pogrom type, the spontaneous explosions of violence, more or less spontaneous. But that's a small number in the total context. So that's why I argue that if you look at the total statistical victim of the Holocaust, without those three broad policies I mentioned, we can't talk about the Holocaust. It was violent. It was terrible. But it wasn't that. And in fact, one scholar I know is doing research which might show that, for example, in terms of this kind of communal violence carried out by people on the ground without much central direction, this is the key point, I guess, the 1918 to 21 period, during this civil war of the Russian Empire, when it collapsed, it's possible that more Jews were killed then than during the 1941. But once it got started in early August, this changes overnight. This is an explosion of violence that is unprecedented. I mean, if you look at the chart, you have mid-August to late September is a real, in the provinces, is annihilation. It's happened so quickly. And it is organized. I mean, there's the central direction. All the killings follow a similar pattern, unlike, for example, some of the pogroms. You know, like in the Lietukis garage, people were beaten with metal bars. In other areas, they were shot. But in this case of the organized killing Holocaust by bullets, they follow a similar pattern almost always. People are, usually Soviet POWs, local people, even Jews, are told to go outside town and dig long trenches. Next day, the killers arrive. They're organized. They know what they're doing. They maybe have the local police do convoy duty. They sometimes dragoon local peasants into putting people in wagons and bringing them there. And then, of course, they have developed their skills at killing. One of the horrible aspects of it, you find out about reading these documents and interrogation reports. Almost without exception, the shooters were drunk. Alcohol is mentioned so often in the interviews and reports that it's commonplace. And that, of course, is to dampen any potential empathy for the victims. In fact, one of the arguments for turning towards industrialized killing was to make the killing easier, not for the victims, but for the killers, not to have that direct confrontation. In fact, I know this is terrible to say, killing by gas in Auschwitz was worse than shooting. Death took longer, and by accounts of certain medical personnel that you read, was in some ways more painful than the other kind of death. So, and that, I mean, everybody who studies this has to, at some point in their work, take a break, because you can't read this material consistently for very long. It is, and there's no, basically, the answer to how people could have done this we study it. We study the ideology. We study the anti-Semitic tropes that became popular and the ones that were the pseudoscience, the eugenics. We study all this. But in the end, you're stuck with that question on some level that is unanswerable, at least I think in my own experience.
Shall I assume that they went from, say, the Baltic to west, east across Lithuania, according to that map? Or
Yeah.
How did it go?
Yeah, they started in the Lithuanian case, the killing started in the northeast, the organized ones, the ones we're talking about here. In Jürgen Methaus of the museum, Holocaust Museum, says for him that's a caesura, a turning point, because so many women and children were killed. You can see it in the statistics. Some of the men had already been killed. So it starts there. Then it goes in a kind of a curve from the Šiauliai region southward and winds up in the Kaunas area by late August, more or less. So they you know, there is a kind of an arrow that goes that way. And then sometimes they double back. For instance, they find out that there's a typhus epidemic in one place near Prienai. So they hustle back and they complete that job. Reading the reports of these officers who are reporting back to headquarters after doing this, using euphemisms, of course, saying they were engaged in special actions, indicates a high level of very cold-blooded professionalism. It's one explanation of how they could bring themselves to do this. As I don't know what else to say. I mean, yeah, there is a system and method. I mean, it's not. In fact, Carl Jäger, who wrote the master file report on the killings on December 1st, 1941, and sent it to Berlin, complained in his report that says, look, I wanted to go into the big ghettos. Vilnius, Kaunas, and Šiauliai, Švenčionys were the last urban ghettos remaining after the shtetls were destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. And he says, but the Wehrmacht and the local governments said, no, we need these workers. He says, I wanted to kill them, but they stood in the way. How one explains that kind of mind, your guess is as good as mine.
Well, it's very informative to learn about the righteous people in Lithuania. Thank you for sharing that information.
They were a very diverse group.
We have some online questions and comments. Can I go to the online audience and get back here?
So we have many thanks for your lecture, and people are really glad they could hear it. One person thanked you for mentioning her aunt, Jadwiga Jablonskaya, who fostered Jewish daughter Dele and reunited her with her parents and still lives in Oslo today. That's Lena Temeshikin. And we have several questions, so maybe I'll just give you one. Would you know specific numbers of Jews deported to Siberia in 1940? Also, numbers of Jews who fled from Poland to Vilnius after 1939?
On the second question, I do not know the 1959 figures. 1959, and then the 39. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Oh, we do. We have information. The 1941 figure, the Jews among the deportees made up about 9%. So the deportees were roughly, it's 18,000 or more. So you take about 9% of that were Jews. Might be a little higher because some people classified as Poles were probably Jews. The case of Menachem Begin, who was in that deportation in 1941 June. So we have figures on that. They're in the books. Unfortunately, in many Western narratives, old figures are still cropping up. 40,000, and that there were 7,000 Jews who made up like 30%. That's been debunked. So look, many of these figures that were once put forth no longer operate. Auschwitz was once, it was said that 4 million people died in Auschwitz. We now know it was 1.1 million. And when Yehuda Bauer, the great historian, put this out in public, I mean, he got some real blowback by people who said, "What are you doing? You're minimizing the suffering of our people." So yes, now when Polish Jews fled to Vilnius and Lithuania in 1939, escaping the war, well, this is interesting because it gets in with Sugihara. The book by Levine, is it Irvin Levine, on Sugihara is not correct. The 10,000 figure doesn't work because a Russian historian, Ilya Altman, has looked at it, and there weren't many Jews getting tickets from Kaunas to Vladivostok or any other region. But a disproportionate number of Polish Jews fleeing from Lithuania into Poland were yeshiva students. Hence, the very high percentage of young males rather than families. There were about, there were among civilians fleeing into Vilnius, the government in 1939 fall numbered about 30 to 40,000. There is a book by Simonas Streltsovas which has all the figures. If the reader reads Lithuanian, he can get all the information. And that, of course, included at least 10,000, 15,000 Jews. But some of them were fleeing not the Germans, but the Soviets, because they didn't want to study yeshiva under the Soviet rule. So, I mean, there are tricky questions here. And and then some of them did get this transit visas via Sugihara. But not only Sugihara, the Lithuanian government also issued transit visas before the occupation of June 15th, 1940, and even afterwards, when Lithuania was still technically not part of the Soviet Union. In fact, we have a message from Stalin that allows the Lithuanian government before the August annexation of the Lithuanian SSR, saying, yes, go ahead and issue visas to... what I would suggest to your question there, the good story here is, and a simple one, is that research on this now in Lithuania is vast. And although unfortunately a lot of it is in Lithuanian, it is accessible and it will answer a lot of questions. And this is from within archives that had been closed to research before 1990. There are at least, to my way of thinking, about 50 to 100,000 pages of local government documentation of local governments during the German occupation and even more during the Soviet occupation, which answer a lot of questions. These documents had not been available and researched. And they do change, for example, the number of people deported to Siberia. Who was deported? The number of people coming into Poland in 1939. Who was it? These questions are now being answered.
Thank you.